Hello, and a very warm welcome to Scotland, at least a virtual version. People normally come to visit us to see the impressive mountains, castles, and deep lochs, but today we will be exposing another aspect of Scotland, its amazing contributions to science and technology. It has no right to claim such a place, a small nation of around 5 million on the cold, isolated northwest corner of Europe. But Scotland has been doing science for a very long time, and its stories are scattered across the whole landscape, from Stranraer to Kirkwall and beyond. Wherever you go, there is a science story, and it's my aim to expose some of these. My name is Shane Cloud, and I have spent my career working in science and tech at universities and laboratories around the world. Like most folk, when I travel, I like to play tourist, and nothing pleases me more than to find some interesting science story in amongst the usual fare of history and architecture. This was my main motivation for this series, to add a bit of spice to any planned visit to Scotland. But when trying to put this together, I found that while there is much written for visitors on Scottish history, landscape, art, and literature, there are few books or programmes covering the science stories of Scotland. A recent contribution, Scotland's Science by John Mellis, published in 2020, is a rare exception and is certainly worth checking out. This is my attempt to help redress the situation. So, how are we going to do this? A daunting task indeed. It's impossible here to acknowledge the many thousands of individuals and their struggles that have established scientific Scotland, but instead I will attempt to give a frame or skeleton of 12 key selected contributors from which the flesh of many others can be added, as we will see. So let's take a look at the plan. So here it is, the full menu. In red, the 12 key pivots, many names probably already familiar to you. But for each we tell a story in 3 chapters, those in the top 12 considered perhaps a must for any appreciation of science in Scotland, chapter 1, followed by those who should also be mentioned in any wider narrative as chapter 2, and finally those who could be mentioned for their key contributions to the themes developed across the 12 topics. This gives us a manageable top-down framework to explore the many varied aspects of scientific Scotland. The 12 chapters will be addressed in no particular chronological order or importance, as 12 separate presentations, forming the rows of this table, and for each we will move from left to right, from must to should to could, hopefully showing how each of the 12 provides an important pivot for so many other stories and innovations, because in my view it is by seeing connections that stories become interesting. It'll be a diverse and hopefully interesting and eclectic journey, also a geographically diverse story. Really, wherever you go in Scotland, you can find good stories to tell, even in the remotest parts of the Highlands or on top of our tallest mountain, Ben Nevis, as we will see later. But let's start with probably the most famous name. James Watt, Master of Steam. Now most usually associated with a unit of power and with the prefix kilo often attached, the kilowatt or kilowatt hour, a unit we have all become too familiar with in this energy expensive world. His story of how to harness energy to our lives is quite the journey and very Scottish. A good beginning, so let's go. So meet a bewigged James Watt. And first, some fake news about him dispelled. He did not invent the steam engine, and he was not inspired by watching a kettle boil. Both stories actually I was told as a child. But he was no myth, just a man of his time, part of the wider explosion of knowledge and enterprise now known as the Scottish Enlightenment, centred on the 18th and early 19th centuries, generating not just scientists but philosophers like David Hume and the father of economics, a man of Kirkcaldy in Fife, Adam Smith, whose famous book The Wealth of Nations was published in 1776 and helped shape modern free market economics. Although not strictly a scientist, he did come up with my favourite definition of science, and here it is. According to Smith, science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. Still true today, I would say, but also, a tad ironically, science can itself be seen as a great engine for economic growth, generating new economies, new employments, new prosperity. And one man in particular, a contemporary and countryman of Smith, showed us how this can happen. So let's turn to the real story of James Watt. Well, he was born in Greenock, a coastal town just west of Glasgow, to middle-class parents in 1736. A statue is there now to commemorate their most famous son. He had a mixture of homeschooling and going to the local grammar school, and showed a rare talent for combining actually mathematics with practicality, with being able to build things. Still a rare talent. This eventually led him to a post as an instrument repairer at Glasgow University, where in an age when patronage was just as key as talent, he met and impressed many great minds, particularly Joseph Black, who we will meet later on, who was working at the time on early ideas of latent heat, why sometimes when you heat things, the temperature does not increase. They became good friends, and Black became an investor in Watt's ideas eventually. But all this led James to being able to combine a kind of dual job, working with his hands while thinking about things. A combination that led him to surprise many of his contemporaries at the university, who expected often a simple workman to turn up and got somebody who'd solve their problems for them. And some very big ideas. As background to this story, in 1712, Thomas Newcomen invented a steam engine to pump water from mines. Nobody thought it much useful for anything else. But then James had a eureka moment. He had been working on a model of such an engine and went for a walk on Glasgow Green, a park that's still there in the centre of Glasgow. It was a Sunday in 1765. A stone memorial now marks the spot close to Nelson's column in the park. When Watt suddenly realised a way to vastly improve the efficiency of the Newcomen engine, and we mean vast, an effective 300% increase in efficiency, unheard of in usual engineering developments these days. Simply by using a separate condenser, the main cylinder stays hot, the condenser stays cold, instead of heating and cooling the whole assembly. Simple idea, but it made steam power ubiquitous, and not just for pumping out mines, soon in every factory and mill in the land. But in a typical Scottish twist, James had to wait 24 hours. There was no work allowed on a Sunday in 18th century Scotland. He couldn't go in the office. He had to wait until Monday morning, when he sat down to write it all out and work out some of the initial calculations. We can imagine his panic. Would he remember everything? This flash of inspiration? Well, he did. He wrote it all down and eventually patented the ideas. However, it was not an overnight success. It took him 9 years until his work really started. In the meantime, he was working on canal surveying and also further improvements to steam flow in his engine design. In fact, he got to implement the practicalities of some of his engines by working with John Roebuck of Carron Ironworks, who we will meet later on. But then in 1773, personal and financial problems hit him, and he needed a change. And that change came by meeting two men who really did change his life. In 1774, he met Matthew Bolton, entrepreneur who founded Soho Ironworks in Birmingham. James moved there and never looked back, becoming a member of the famous Lunar Society, a southern partner to the scientific clubs associated with his homeland. Their engines became so popular that earlier versions like Newcomen's were largely forgotten, and hence the idea started that Watt invented steam engines. He also met his fellow countryman William Murdoch. Actually, William Murdoch met him. He walked 300 miles to Birmingham for a job interview, and luckily he got it. And he became an exceptional assistant, full of good ideas. For example, he had the idea for a steam car on roads, using steam for transport, not just for power. It never saw the light of day, apparently only a model chugging around his living room. But he also pioneered gaslighting, which certainly did go on to make a big impact on society. But Watt did live to see his ideas become transport by taking himself a trip on the Comet, an early steamboat on the Clyde, in 1816, shown here, popping up the Clyde, a replica. When Watt was an old man, probably reflecting on the scale of his success in the city where it all began. Henry Bell's Comet was the latest innovation in an already bustling Glasgow of the time. The first steamboat had been built in 1803, the Charlotte Dundas, but it was built for canal work, not for open waters. And it was 1812 before the first commercial steam passenger ship, the Wooden Comet, ran between Glasgow and Helensburgh, just down the Clyde, where Bell coincidentally lived and was provost. A risky business, however, early developments like this. In 1820 it sank near Oban on the west coast, so Bell built Comet 2. It too sank, tragically killing 62 people, so he gave up, but others did not and took up the idea of building ships on the Clyde. We will talk about this later. So it seems Watt was lucky to have an uneventful trip in 1816. He lived another 3 years and died at a good age 83 in Birmingham. There are statues now in Westminster Abbey in London, on George Square in the centre of Glasgow, as well, of course, as in Greenock, where he was born. He is now seen as the main inspirational figure of the wider Industrial Revolution. While inspiration is a key element of progress, I would argue there are at least 5 other key requirements for the big-time success that came to Scotland after Watt. Let's look at them, using examples of the characters from Scotland's story of steam. So, first of all, you need people that have got vision, that try to think big and imagine where you can take a new technology. In that regard, meet the Napiers. No, not the famous inventor of logarithms, we will meet him later, but a Glasgow family. Robert, now called the father of Clyde shipbuilding, and 2 other characters. His son, Robert II, who developed their first big market, providing Glasgow-built riverboats for the mighty Murray River in Australia, and cousin David, who made the engine for the Wooden Comet of 1812, the one that Watt sailed in. In 1800 there was no major shipbuilding on the River Clyde. Then came the vision of these 3 men to combine 2 technologies, iron and steam, to make a new type of ship. The first iron boat in Scotland was the Vulcan in 1819. It had no engine, horse-drawn on a canal, but it was the first ever iron ship in the world to have a proper hull shape. An earlier one on the River Severn in England was just a simple flat barge. But it was a great novelty tourist attraction, the idea that iron can float. Many were sceptical. So here was the first real boat of iron. You can, by the way, still go and see the Vulcan at Summerlee Industrial Museum in central Scotland. So, what to do about joining steam with iron? Well, first the engines. Robert opened several foundries to cast iron suitable for high steam pressure. He built his first steam engine in 1823 for a paddle steamer called the Leven. The ship is now gone, but the engine still remains outside Dumbarton Maritime Museum, as you can see the blue picture here in the centre. This secured his reputation, so this engine was important in the development of Clyde shipbuilding. He went on to build the first 4 Cunard liners crossing the Atlantic by steam power. Then he acquired even more foundries and opened a shipyard in Govan in central Glasgow in 1843, specialising in Australian river steamers at first. The company went on from there, over 100 vessels built by the 1860s, and by then employing 3,000 men, making ships for international markets. The adventure of Clyde-built began with him. Eventually, in the 1890s, British shipyards built 75% of the world's shipping, 2/3 of which came from the Clyde. That's half the world's shipping. By some counts, over 30,000 ships and 100,000 men employed in this post-Watt extravaganza. Now, I'm afraid, largely gone. There are a few shipyards still operating on the Clyde, and a few of the enormous cranes stand sentinel over docks, now more often used for concert and conference venues. One of them, COP26 in November 2021, was an urgent international discussion of what to do about the negative aspects of Watt's legacy, and just a few yards away from where Watt had his eureka moment. And what of the steam legacy in Scotland? Well, outside the museums, we still have an operational paddle steamer, the SS Waverley, the last paddle steamer built on the Clyde in 1946, and you can take trips up and down the Clyde in the summer months. The second great thing you need, apart from vision, is to inspire the youth, because they will be the next generation to carry forward the work. And in that regard, we've got no better example than this guy, James Naismith. He was the son of a famous Edinburgh painter, Alexander Nasmyth, a key figure in artistic Edinburgh of the 18th century. But at age 17, the son James made his first steam engine, and then this became his life's passion. Eventually, in 1831, he opened an engineering workshop in Edinburgh, manufacturing machine tools and over 100 locomotives. His main claim to fame is the invention of the steam hammer. Facing the challenge of building big iron ships, like, for example, the SS Great Britain of 1843, which needed enormous new machinery, so he developed steam-driven tools, which revolutionized industry in Scotland. Higher quality at half the price. When he saw the first steam hammer in operation, he said, "There it was, in truth, a thumping child of my brain." By the 1850s, nearly 500 hammers were at work around the world, from Russia to India to Australia. The father was inspired by landscape, the son by steam and power. I don't know if the father was disappointed or proud of his son, but change came quickly to post-Watt Scotland through inspiration. And steam was not only found in Glasgow, it's important to remember it made its impact across the whole country. One of these monster hammers does survive and can still be seen in the Scottish Maritime Museum. The third thing you need is enterprise, and in that regard, consider the story of the Carron Ironworks, home to a true weapon of mass destruction, the carronade, as shown in this picture here, which was developed from the vision of three men bringing together three key ingredients: water, coal, and iron ore. The River Carron near Falkirk in central Scotland had access to all. The Carron Company was founded in 1759 as a collaboration of a scientist, John Roebuck, a merchant, William Cadell, and an entrepreneur, Sam Garbeth. And the whole was truly greater than the sum of the parts. Together they established large-scale iron industry in Scotland using coke, free from charcoal limits, like at Bono in the Highlands, relying on local forest access, and still there as an outdoor industrial museum in the splendour of the Highlands. They built on a scale never seen before, combining furnaces, forges, and mills in one site with good canal connections. The furnaces inspired Robert Burns on a visit to compare it directly to hell. High-pressure ironwork was used by James Watt in his work, but also made for deadlier cannons, which helped Britannia rule the waves in a compact shipborne cannon of immense destructive power, called the carronade. By 1814, we had the biggest ironworks in Europe, but failure to innovate, over-diversification, and the inevitable competition caused furnaces off in 1963 and closure in 1982. Now there is very little left to see, except the River Carron itself, of course, and the canals, now used for leisure. And lying close to one, a large-scale modern working iron structure built in 2002, the Falkirk Wheel, a unique rotating boat lift joining two canals, 1,200 tons of steel in a slowly rotating structure, on which you can take a unique canal trip as a visit. It replaced what used to be 11 locks joining the two canals, which took a full day to traverse the lock system itself. So an important working piece of industrial heritage here. The next thing you have to do is see off any competition for a new technology. And this story is about how eventually steam beats sail. When new technologies come along, they have to compete with older, more established ones, which are reluctant to give up. And none was more controversial, in fact, than the debate between steam and sail for ships. In this regard, meet John Elder, who grew up in a Glasgow of steam and followed his father into maritime engine design. David Elder had contributed greatly to the development of engine technology for Robert Napier back in the 1820s. Now, John made an important breakthrough himself in 1854 by perfecting the compound steam engine, and that's an engine that recycles its exhaust to extract even more power from the engine. Two things to say about this. First, it's a difficult thing to make happen. Many had tried, many had failed, and it took the genius of John to make it happen. Elder was later described by Professor Rankin as a true genius of engineering. Second, it tipped the balance between sail and steam. Up until then, it had been touch and go, making the latter finally win out. Steam was then definitely more efficient, and it was only a matter of time before we saw the demise of sailing ships. But only after one last burst of activity with the fast T-clippers, the most famous of which, the Cutty Sark, with its sleek wooden hull on an iron frame, was built in Scotland in the shadow of Dumbarton Rock in 1869 for long-distance fast trade in tea from China and wool from Australia. There was lots of public interest in 1872 for the race against another Scottish clipper, which Sark lost. The winner was called Thermopylae, built in Aberdeen in 1868, a year before the Cutty Sark, using Aberdeen bow technology, basically a sharp front pioneered by Aberdeen shipyards. In fact, Aberdeen built the very first fast clipper, the Scottish Maid, in 1839, and many of the world's fastest sailing ships. So it's important to note that not all shipbuilding in Scotland was in Glasgow. But Elder's improved steam power and the opening of the Suez Canal eventually led to even these fine sailing ships being retired. The Sark in 1895, luckily, of course, it was saved for public view. Now you can go and see it in Greenwich Dry Dock in London. Not so good for the Thermopylae. It was sunk for torpedo practice in Portugal in 1907. The Cutty Sark was designed by Hercules Linton, another Scot, who has a very grand memorial, in fact, in the small town of Inverbervie on the east coast of Scotland, where he was born. So we've had four key elements that explain the massive success of Scotland post-Watt. The final thing is about teaching and the teaching of new skills. And there's no better example than this man, John Anderson. He was described as a natural philosopher, what we would today call a physicist, and a liberal educator. John did more than anybody else to advance the technical education of ordinary working men and women in Scotland. He is best remembered now as the posthumous founder of Anderson College in Glasgow, which became the University of Strathclyde. It's still one of Scotland's finest technical universities. A complex character, John, at time a soldier. He was an officer in the Hanoverian Army of 1745, a professor of Oriental languages, and finally professor of natural philosophy at Glasgow University for nearly 40 years, the main structure of his life, from 1757 to 1796. He was one of the founders of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, which has a HQ now on George Street in Edinburgh itself, and it's still one of the country's key scientific organisations. He held popular science lectures and promoted technical education for all. His lectures were notoriously flamboyant, and he became known as Jolly Jack Phosphorus. But not so jolly when it came to university politics, alienating many of his academic colleagues and eventually endowing funds for a new college, explicitly excluding staff from the other uni in Glasgow, the university itself. In 1964, this new college eventually became Strathclyde University, which now has a substantial John Anderson Physics Building, the Andersonian Library, and Anderson Campus, all in his honour. So, as we come to the end of this first presentation about industrial and scientific Scotland, where can you go now to see the legacy of all this work that went on? Well, the bad news is that much evidence has been demolished, as we have seen several times already. It seems that buildings of industry and technology are the first to go in any politician's view of a bright new future. Nonetheless, some remain, and some excellent museums are out there, staffed by enthusiastic volunteers and heritage professionals. Here is a selective list of my favourites. From the preserved mill towns to a hollowed out mountain for hydropower, and museums to iron, coal and oil, we pass to Scotland's maritime history, a great stimulus for innovation, as we have already seen. On to our biggest natural outdoor museum, if you will, a geopark, dedicated to geology of the Northwest Highlands, a stunning landscape that challenged science for decades, and one of our stories to come. Contrast this with the very small, like the tiny room where James Clerk Maxwell was born. And he is going to be the main pivot for our next theme and next week's talk. Thank you for watching.